For those of you who can't see it, the Hooks Book Award is sitting behind me right above my chrome dome that I won't show you by bending my head forward. But you know, it really is a cool thing to be able to reflect upon. And you know, I will say just up top that you know, while I'm very humbled and grateful for the award, I admit a little bit of ambivalence about my relationship to the book, because you know, to get back to something that Chuck had said about being a book that we need right now. I think he's right, and I wish we didn't, right? I mean, that's the reality of doing this work, is that, you know, I mean, when I started the research that became this book, you know, I think a lot of people look at a book that has a 2019 publication date and see that it's about policing in Black Chicago and assume that it is some sort of response to, you know, the crises that, you know, that have really been brought to the foreground by organizers and activists, you know, since 2013 and beyond. But the reality is that I started doing this work really in 2008. And so, you know, I've been living with and thinking about these, you know, these systems of oppression and the resistance to them, which I think is an important thing to also be aware of. But I've been thinking about these systems of oppression and the resistances to them for, you know, going on 12 years now. And so that's really what kind of the origin points of the book are. I don't want to spend a lot of time just like reading from the book or trying to summarize a 250-page book, because I think that would be to miss an opportunity to actually talk and reflect upon why I think the book is important. But I will just try to give a very brief overview. I mean, so you know, the book is really an examination of how, beginning in the 19 teens, and really especially ramping up during the mid parts of the 20th century, Black Chicago began to really become the focal point of police repression, police surveillance, and police harassment, and about how that really cascaded and snowballed, you know, after, in the post-World War II era, downwards through the 1960s and onward, you know, onward through really today. I ended the book really in the early 1970s. So I really am tracking this history from really beginning in 1919 with this horrific race riot in the city of Chicago. And I carry it through the early 70s for a couple of reasons. So let me just explain why I bracketed the book in that way. So in the 19 teens, as part of the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South into northern cities, it's really during this time period that Chicago begins to assume a substantial Black population. It's not by any means an enormous population, but it's a big enough and a segregated enough population in the city of Chicago to provoke racial conflict in the city that had not really been all that evident in years before that. It's not to say that everything had been, you know, that everything had been friendly and affable between white and Black communities in Chicago in the years before that. But because of Black in-migration and white terrorism against Black migrants into the city, there's a real uptick in racial conflict during the late 19 teens. So you have white terrorists who bomb Black homes, bomb Black businesses year after year after year, and you get a police department that just can't do anything about it or won't do anything about it. And kind of the climax of that story is in the summer of 1919, when a white man murders a Black boy at a beach by throwing rocks at him when he's on a raft out in the shores of Lake Michigan. And this boy's name is Eugene Williams, and he ends up dying. And what happens from there is that you have a group of Black citizens that have seen what happened, and they ran to a Black police officer and demanded that that police officer arrest this white man who has just murdered Eugene Williams. And one of this officer's white colleagues intervenes and says, "We are not going to arrest this murderer," a man named George Stauber. And from that moment, the city of Chicago descends into just utter violence. So over the span of about the following week, 38 Chicagoans are killed. This is an event that is best characterized as white mobs terrorizing Black communities and Black communities taking up arms in self-defense to protect their homes, their families, their bodies, and their communities. And over the course of this week, that sees 38 people killed in the city, a majority of them Black, but also some of them white, there's some patterns in terms of how police react that begin to emerge. And the patterns that I think are the most important are twofold. So on the one hand, during this event, Black people cannot reliably turn to the police to protect them from white terrorist violence. So you have Black citizens who are, running from mobs and who go seek shelter and aid from police officers and find themselves turned away, find themselves oftentimes just disregarded, or worse, sometimes, these white police officers will actually join in or aid these white marauders. So on the one hand, you have that where Black citizens cannot really get reliable protection. And on the other hand, you get the Chicago Police Department and its individual officers who disproportionately mete out violence upon Black people during the riot, and who also arrest Black people in rampant disproportion during the riot. And so the reason that I begin the story there is because these are two really important and entangled themes that we see weaving through this history over the course of the next 50 years and indeed into the present day. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But suffice to say that that was really what prompted me to kind of begin the story there, is because that was where I began to see these threads really emerging. And the reason that I ended in the early 1970s is twofold. On the one hand, that's a really important moment in time in Chicago's history. So in late 1960s Chicago, you have a flurry of Black radical and cross-racial organizing that is a really important model of interracial solidarity that really sends city politicians and city police officials into a massive, massive panic. And the real central node of this organizing is the Black Panther Party in the city of Chicago. And so this is an organization that is led by a brilliant young organizer by the name of Fred Hampton, who's 21 years old at this moment in time. And Hampton and the Panthers that he is part of are organizing in the Black community for things like community medical centers, to get people who don't have access to good healthcare, to get them healthcare. They're organizing in the Black community to provide breakfast for children who can't afford it. They're organizing to be able to shuttle citizens of Chicago to prisons downstate so that they can go visit incarcerated loved ones who are locked up 2 hours away from the neighborhoods in which they live. So they're doing these types of things. At the same time, they are also organizing with Puerto Rican community organizers, with poor white community organizers, to essentially create something better for everyone in the city, to try to ameliorate the mass immiseration of poverty that was striking so many different communities across the city of Chicago. And the final thing that the Panthers were really doing was bringing into fundamental question the legitimacy of the Chicago Police Department and the things that it did in the city, and in particular in the city's Black neighborhoods. And so what happens as a result of that is that the Chicago Police Department, in coordination with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, conduct a raid on December 4th of 1969, in which they execute Fred Hampton in his bed while he is sleeping next to his pregnant fiance. It's a really pivotal moment in the history of the city of Chicago. And the way that it relates to this particular book is that not only is that in and of itself an important story in the history of repressive and violent policing in Chicago, but it also spurs an incredible wave of organizing and the explosion of new activist impulses, activist organizations that really mobilize in his memory to challenge the legitimacy of the Chicago Police Department, people who had no radical politics whatsoever before that moment understand that this is such a fundamental injustice that it requires a reckoning. And so I wanted to really take the story through that and to kind of think about how people were able to respond to these moments of incredible police violence and repression. The second reason that I took it through the early 1970s is I really wanted to question one of the fundamental premises that I think a lot of people have when it comes to policing in the United States. And that is an assumption that the crises that we currently are living with are new. Because a lot of the scholarship that was published or that was out there when I was beginning this work was essentially treating the war on drugs of the 1970s and especially the 1980s as having some sort of transformative impact on policing in the United States. And there's been some other absolutely fantastic scholarship that has come out since then that has pushed that chronology back a little bit into the 1960s, but has nevertheless still held that these federal impulses like the war on crime and the war on drugs were what transformed policing in the United States. The reality is that if you look at the city of Chicago and other cities like it, you can actually see how local politicians, local police officials, how they were really, really central and fundamental in building these repressive regimes that came to disproportionately target Black communities, as well as Latinx communities, as well as Indigenous communities, as well as queer communities, as well as poor communities in general, as well as immigrant communities. And so we have to take seriously the local actors, because when we do, we are able to get a better understanding and a better view of how entrenched these crises are within our various communities and within our society as a whole. So that's sort of a broad overview of the book. And I just want to offer what I think are a few important takeaways for people that I hope will help kind of connect this history to the present and think more about why it matters and think more about how it might help us understand, you know, the year that we are living through in 2020. So the first point that I want people to make, and I'm going to try to make these not so Chicago specific, but because Chicago is the city that I spent a long time researching, you know, a lot of it's going to be Chicago specific. But the first point that I think people need to understand is that, you know, I think most Americans today have an idea of why the police exist. And that idea is that the police exist to keep us safe, right? To keep sort of all of us kind of a generic public safe. That's not true. Like, the reason why American police forces were founded was not to kind of keep a generic, generalized public safe. So we can look at a number of different examples of what this looked like, right? I mean, so one of the things that that historians have correctly pointed out and that activists correctly refer to is the fact that in a lot of southern cities, there was a huge amount of overlap between the founding of Southern police forces and the slave patrols, right? So slave patrols had a really, really intimate and direct relationship with early police forces. So you have, on the one hand, these organizations that are deputized to criminalize Black freedom, to criminalize Black mobility, to surveil and punish the people for the supposed crime of stealing their own bodies and souls away to freedom. And the early germinations of these police departments. So we see this in a variety of southern cities, and even cities that we wouldn't necessarily, you know, think of as being southern, right? I mean, so like we can look back on the Baltimore uprising of the last decade, and people should know that the Baltimore Police Department owes its origins to white men being deputized to police free Black people in that city during and after the Civil War. And so, you know, think about that as one side of this story, right? The other side of the story that, you know, we can think about when it comes to a city like Chicago, because when the city of Chicago first gets a formalized police department in 1853, it's not really all that concerned about Black folks, because Black folks are not really a big enough population for city elites to be that concerned about. The reason that the city of Chicago gets a police department in the year 1853 is because city elites and civic boosters want a police force that they can rely upon to control the supposedly undesirable behaviors of European immigrant groups. So today we would say, like, if we're thinking about people who, you know, are descended from German ancestry, or people who are descended from Italian ancestry or Irish ancestry, we would, I think for the most part, people would just say that those folks are white. At that point in time, they were not really welcomed into the brotherhood of native white people. And so what that meant was that you have these elite, wealthy civic boosters who are really concerned about things like German drinking habits and Irish drinking habits and so on and so forth. And so they demand and indeed fund the original Chicago Police Department to use as a weapon against those European immigrant groups. And the secondary function of the police department in those early years was also to crack down on working class people when they would do things like try to go out on strike and launch other forms of labor activism in pursuit of bettering their lives, in pursuit of getting things like an 8-hour workday, in pursuit of getting things like living wages, in pursuit of getting workplace safety, and so on and so forth. So the police would be brought in to break these strikes, oftentimes in really, really repressive and violent means. And so if you take these kind of twin stories, if you look at, you know, things like the Southern slave patrols, you can look elsewhere as well, right? You can, I mean, and I'm drawing upon the scholarship of all sorts of colleagues who I really admire when I you know, launch into these other stories. But I mean, you can also look at, you know, the history of kind of Western imperialism and colonization, colonialism, and understand how police are complicit in that prospect of the, you know, decimation and removal of indigenous people as well, right? I mean, so, but if you take all of these stories together, and whether we're talking about European immigrants, or whether we're talking about enslaved people, or whether we're talking about people in the borderlands, what we are talking about is a founding story of the police department, of police departments across the United States, as being really founded to do two things. The first of those is to uphold hierarchies of race and ethnicity. The second of those is to protect private capital, right? So to protect things like, say, the sanctity of big business owners to, you know, to repress and indeed murder their own workers when those workers demand a living wage, right? And so if we think about the police as doing, you know, one or both of two things when they are first founded, whether that be in Chicago, whether that be in Baltimore, whether that be in Los Angeles, and so on and so forth. If we think about the police as being founded to do these two things, I think that that's important to understand and think about. Because if that's what the police were founded to do, perhaps we should ask ourselves if that's what the police still do. And I would make the case that that is indeed what police still do. And so I think that that's an important point for people to consider. The second and deeply related point that I want people to think about is that if we understand that the police were not founded in order to, you know, quote unquote, again, just keep us safe, keep all of us safe, regardless of, you know, who we are, where we come from, what racial identity we hold, what gender identity we hold, where we stand on the class spectrum. If we understand that the police were not founded in order to just keep a generic public safe, then maybe it makes sense that the police are still not all that good at doing that. And so let me again just draw you back to something that I said very early on in my comments. So when I was talking about the 1919 race riot in Chicago, I said that, you know, two of the emerging threads that I saw happening during that event were that the police were simultaneously failing to keep Black people safe, while at the same time disproportionately harassing and arresting Black people. This is important because this is going to be an ongoing theme and an ongoing thread in the history of Black Chicago. And by the 1960s, Black activists would talk about this in a very particular language. And the language that they used was that they said that Black communities in Chicago were both over-patrolled and underprotected. And they really articulated this as two sides of the same coin. And what they meant by that was that when Black communities were experiencing the police in Chicago, it was as agents of violence and surveillance and harassment. That it was in many, many ways about the police swarming Black communities on the South and West sides, just doing stop and, creating or having massive waves of stop and frisks, of having incredible off the charts accusations and evidence of officer involved violence and homicides against community members. So you have on the one side, Black communities that are disproportionately likely to be over-policed, to be subject to harassment and surveillance and violence and so on and so forth, while at the same time, those were the same communities that were experiencing the least amount of unsafety within them. So that, by the end of the 1960s, Black communities in the city of Chicago are experiencing a really, really stark and alarming rise in homicides. But at the same time, police activity was not doing anything to solve those other than just harassing citizens left and right. And so Black activists by the 1960s were essentially asking the question of what the point is. And I think that that is, again, an important thing for people to bear in mind. That if on the one hand, the same communities that are the most subject to police repression are also the ones that reap the least supposed benefits of policing, then you have to ask yourself what the point is, right? And I would just add that we can look at how this is played out in the modern context as well. And I'll just give you two very, very brief statistics. Like if we think that the point of the police is to keep people safe, and by keep people safe, I mean reducing harm and reconciling harm and preventing harm. If we assume that that is what the police are supposed to do, then keep these things in mind. Last year in the city of Chicago, in the year 2019, in all of the incidents of first-degree homicide, the Chicago Police Department made an arrest in precisely 21% of those cases. So in other words, in first-degree homicides in the year 2019, the police registered an arrest in only 21%. So 79% of them, there's no arrest. The statistics are even worse for cases of sexual assault, which is also one of the most harmful acts that a person can commit against another. That police in Chicago over the span of the last decade recorded an arrest in somewhere between 10 and 20% of sexual assaults. So it's 80 to 90% in which they are not making any sort of arrest. And so again, what is the point? Are the police actually good at what we think they should be good at? The answer, generally speaking, is no. And at the same time, the city of Chicago every year spends about $1.8 billion with a B on its police department. And it sort of baffles my mind because I don't know in what other context policymakers and citizens would accept such an absolutely miserable return on investment in what is supposedly a public resource. A third point that I think is very important is that the history of police reform is a history of failure. What I mean by that is that police, people right now are talking about police reform as though it's some sort of novel idea. The police have been reformed and reformed and reformed and reformed, almost literally from the beginning of their foundation. They have been reformed under the guise of professionalizing them. They have been reformed under the guise of making them more accountable. They have been reformed under the guise of making them more efficient. What the history of police reform actually shows us, whether it's in Chicago or elsewhere though, is that none of that has actually made the police more accountable to citizens. None of it has actually made the police a more effective and efficient vehicle for ensuring harm is not done towards and amongst other people. The history of police reform is actually one in which we just see the scope and power of the police and the accepted legitimacy of the police in American society just expanding and expanding and expanding. And so people need to be very wary of what they are talking about when they talk about the history of police reform. Because police reform, if we are to assume that that is going to mean making the police be accountable to the people that they supposedly serve, the history is not on the side of reform. And the final 2 points, and they're very much interrelated, that I want people to understand, and this harkens back and sort of hopefully puts a bow on where I started, is that the first of these, so I guess would be my fourth key point, the fourth of 5. The fourth key point is that the crisis that we are living in is not new. You know, and I said that at the beginning, but I think it's worth repeating. You know, when I was doing the research for occupied territory, one of the things that was really striking to me in a research process that was just striking overall. But, you know, I had a day where I was at the Chicago History Museum and I came across a microfilm of meeting minutes that the police superintendent in Chicago had held with his top administrators from 1960 to 1964. And in those meeting minutes, you can see police talking about all of the things that they say don't happen when it comes to police. So you see, for example, in those meeting minutes, them talking about implementing arrest quotas in Black communities. They don't usually call them Black communities. They just call them, you know, they have euphemisms for them. They call them areas that are in need of aggressive preventive patrol. But what aggressive preventive patrol means is that policing is going to be more aggressive in some neighborhoods and less aggressive in others. And when they are talking about that, they are directly talking about also implementing arrest quotas for people who are working in those neighborhoods. They are also talking in those minutes about citizen accusations of police violence. And they are spinning a public narrative that says that incidents of police brutality don't really exist. Incidents of police torture, literal torture with instruments of torture, don't happen. They're spinning these public narratives, but you can look in the meeting minutes and see them talking about police violence in a way that absolutely verifies its existence. You see them saying, well, we don't really believe that police torture exists. But at the same time, they're talking about, well, maybe we should go looking through officers' lockers to see if we can uncover cattle prods and other things that people are using to torture citizens. And so if we think about that, and if we think about that as being, you know, a history of violence and a history of repression and a history of racism, that is literally 60 years old now. We have to understand that our present has a history. And it's not to say that it traces to 1960. Like, I could pick out any number of different dates from earlier than that. I could look at the 1930s. I could look at the 1920s. And so I think people need to be aware of that. And the final and very much related point that I would just say is that while the crisis is not new, while things like stop and frisk and its racialized, racist implementation, while racist police violence, well, all of these things are not new. Neither is resistance to it, and I think that that's important. I mean, part of the joy and the privilege of receiving this award from an institution named after a luminary like Ben Hooks is we can think about the kind of longer traditions of activism, the longer struggles for freedom and justice, and think about how we can apply the lessons of pardon me, of Dr. Hooks and to our history, to thinking about how we can make sense of this, and thinking about how people who are out in the streets in 2020, fighting for a better world and fighting for a better future, think about how we can situate ourselves and situate our loved ones and our colleagues and our comrades within this larger history, and so I'm thinking here about how we can look at the city of Chicago in the 1930s and look at how organizers were resisting the power of the police and questioning the legitimacy of the police when the police were tasked during the Great Depression with throwing people out of their homes when they couldn't pay their rent, and about how people organized to basically say to the police, you can't do this. And how they would mobilize to literally move everyone's stuff back into their homes after the police had helped to remove it. Right? That's a fundamental challenging of the legitimacy of the police power in the city of Chicago. We can look at the civil rights era in 1950s and 60s Chicago and see how nonviolent activists, both organic to the city and also in 1966 when Dr. King comes to town, about how they are braiding all of these various grievances about racism and oppression in Chicago together, and about how policing is a part of all of that. We can look at the lessons of an organization like the Black Panther Party in Chicago, and especially look at its campaign in the early 1970s to seize community control of the police, and think about how that is a lesson for our own time. Because fundamentally, what the quest for community control for police was, it was a number of things, but it was also a call to defund the police. That it was a call for the community to have the say over what police would look like in their own community. But it was also a recognition that, you know, when Chicago at that point in time is spending $300 million a year on its police force, that it was also a fundamental challenge to that. That part of community control was to say, look, we don't need to spend $300 million on a police force. What happens if we take a bunch of that money and invest it into schools, and invested into community health, and invested into job trainings, and so on and so forth. And so I think that we need to understand that the crisis that we face has a history, but so does the struggle against it. And that is really what I hope the sort of twin threads that my book is able to help us make sense of, and to hopefully help people make sense of the moment and hope and fortify ourselves within it. And I just want to again reiterate my thanks to everyone involved in this election, and to everyone who helped make this event happen. And I will end my comments there and turn it back over to Rory.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. If we could do applause, we would. So I hope everyone that's listening will just give you some applause for this great thought-provoking presentation. And I'll remind our viewers, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box in Facebook. We do have a few questions, Simon, that I'll get started with. The first one being, what sort of reaction did you get from the Chicago Police Department and the City of Chicago in putting together in the development of your book? Was there cooperation? Was there resistance? Was there, this is some great insight to guide us going forward. What sort of reaction did you get in response?
That's a great question. So in the process of researching and writing the book, basically there wasn't a response. And I say that not to say that there was no interaction, but it was basically, I was stonewalled by the police when I asked them for any information that they may have. And this gets to a fundamental problem of doing this type of work, is that, you know, police don't, like, if you're a researcher of the police, you're confronting the reality of researching an institution that doesn't want to be researched, right? And so, you know, and this is true for me. This is true for anybody who, you know, basically any scholar, any historian has had to confront this. I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of different historians who do this work, and it's really tough to get information out of them. I mean, so, you know, I submitted open records requests with the Chicago Police Department, and they basically just said that they have nothing. You know, I mean, most of the information that I had to find was I had to find on my own. Since then, the reaction has been, I would just say, strange. The reason that I say that it's strange is that, you know, the mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, who is, you know, she's a former prosecutor, but I get the sense from my interactions with her that she's a thoughtful woman. And I know for a fact that she has my book. but she has invited me to a couple of different city-sponsored events to give talks that she's also in attendance at. But it's almost like I'm there, like it's almost like I've been there to provide sound bites, in a way that frustrated me at the most recent event. And so the reason I say that is, she held an event in February of this year, which seems like it was 12 years ago. But she held an event that was a summit to figure out ways to eliminate poverty in the city of Chicago. And when it was my time to speak, and I was there specifically at her invitation, and I said, well, one of the ways that we could solve poverty in the city of Chicago is to take a huge chunk of the police department budget and enact a universal basic income for all Chicagoans who live below the poverty line, and there's your answer. And she's like, within like 2 hours after that, when it was her turn to speak next, she very explicitly said, we are not going to defund the police and enact a universal basic income. And so it's been very strange to know that this is a politician who knows my work and who knows what I do, and who seems interested in having me present my ideas on a fairly prominent public stage, but isn't actually willing to kind of grapple with the reality of what I'm suggesting in the book. And I think that's partly a testament to her, her past as a prosecutor, is that she's not really willing to buy into an idea that, we need to really radically imagine the ways that we approach public safety in a way that relies not on police and makes police obsolete, instead of, just sort of reifying their power.
Okay, thank you. That we were just curious about how that's being received, because that would relate also to other cities and the police department. We have a question that interestingly relates a little bit to the book that we honored for 2017, Locking Up Our Own, and that talked about the role of the Black community and some of the changes happening in policing and law enforcement. So the question is, did the rise of Black neighborhood gangs coincide with the creation of the police? And I think by that, I mean the strengthening of the way the policing is happening in the community.
So the answer in Chicago is no. Well, let me back that up. I mean, so when Chicago really begins to kind of revolutionize, like I know it's correct to say that the 1960s are kind of a pivotal moment in the history of the Chicago Police Department. And what I mean by that is this is a period of incredible change in terms of, technologies, investments, statistics keeping, paperwork, and so on and so forth. And like people really, like, we can look at that extended moment and like it's a period of really rapid reforms in the ways that the operations of the police department go. But part of that is that beginning in the early 1960s, that's when the city of Chicago begins to just radically escalate police spending. I mean, so again, to think about how today the city of Chicago spends $1.8 billion a year on its police force, that also is, like that portion of the city's budget as a proportion of the total whole, it didn't used to look like that prior to kind of the 1960s. And people look at that and say, okay, well, maybe that new investment was being done in response to increased violence, and in particular in response to gang violence. But the reality is like Chicago did not experience really escalating violent crime until the late 1960s, which is after it began dumping more and more and more and more and more resources into the police. And so, we can, like, the correlation between increased police spending in the early 1960s does not mean there's a causation, with increased violent gang crime that came later. So what does happen is that in the late 1960s, as gang violence is increasing, the police department does engage in some new tactical innovations, in particular, most notably, the implementation of a gang intelligence unit. the gang intelligence unit is essentially, you know, a kind of elite squad. I mean, elite is in quotes, but elite squad within the police department, whose specific task is supposedly to mitigate gang violence in Black Chicago in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But the history of the gang intelligence unit is actually one of just kind of making things worse. So the you know, the gang intelligence unit in its early years has all the it really has all the appearances of just trying to make the gangs like devolve into total war. So, you know, you have members of the gang intelligence unit who will go pick up a member of the Blackstone Rangers and go, you know, drive him around town, try to, you know, badger him for questions, and then go drop him deep in the turf of the gangster disciples, who are one of the Blackstone Rangers rivals, you know, and basically, you know, that they have now put this person's life in danger by doing this, right? And you know, and police at this moment in time were talking and complaining about how, why can't we get any of these young Black men to cooperate with us when we're trying to solve violent crime? And everybody, you know, everybody around them was basically saying, why would any of them trust you? You know, like, you're doing all of these things that are literally putting their lives at risk. Like, the gang intelligence unit was, you know, constantly out. I mean, they literally made it a crime for anybody who lived in a Black neighborhood, any gathering of more than 3 young Black people in after a certain time of day was literally criminalized in the city of Chicago, and the gang intelligence unit would just swarm them, stop and frisk them, and just arrest them for whatever. And so, you know, you have the gang intelligence unit that is implemented supposedly to help solve gang crime. But, like, again, if we look at the ways in which gang-related homicides were, like, rising in the late 1960s and continued to rise really horrifically through the 1970s, and then began to ebb again in the 1980s. We can look at that kind of escalating rate and number of gang-related homicides, and look also at the ways that the police department was giving the gang intelligence unit increasing power, increasing resources, increasing manpower, and so on and so forth. We can look at those two things side by side and basically say, well, the gang intelligence unit clearly wasn't working, right? And so, you know, so I think that's maybe, I hope that answers the question. You know, if people want to think about it specifically in terms of my relationship to Jim Foreman's work in Locking Up Our Own, I mean, like the things that I talk about in my book are very much in line with the things that Jim talks about in his book, because, you know, I mean, Jim is very clear in his book that, you know, people who were living through these really traumatic escalations of violence, like, advocated for you know, better and more, you know, better and you know, more effective policing in Black communities in response to escalating violence. But they didn't only advocate for that, right? That part of Jim's central thesis is that, you know, Black communities were left without a lot of options. And so they asked for more and better and more effective policing in the short term, while also advocating for longer term investments in the infrastructure and community life and health of Black communities, as a way to, you know, effectively ensure that, you know, that violent crime would eventually decline absent any sort of police action.
Right, right. Thank you. So we do have a few more questions. I know we're getting close to the hour, but I want to get as many of the questions in as we can.
I'll try to be quicker in my responses. I'm
No,
sorry.
that's okay. It's very informative and helpful. And you talked about the failures with some of the police reform efforts. Could you identify a few proposed best practices for police reform, some that have actually worked, or things that you've seen be effective in other cities?
I mean, you know, I'm not a believer in reform. I mean, I hope I made that fairly clear. I think that we've reached a point in time where we need to be thinking about things beyond reform. But I will say that, you know, because, you know, creating the conditions for a society in which, you know, people will buy into, like, no longer needing to rely upon an institution like policing. You know, I mean, I think that we can look at the models of, certainly not, I would say, many other American cities, but we can look at what other countries do, because one of the central things, I mean, there's a lot of, like, the list of problems with American policing is absolutely endless. But one of the things is that, you know, we as a society have tasked police with doing so many different things that they're not trained to do, and that frankly they don't really want to do. And so, like, you know, we might look at, for example, some Scandinavian countries where, you know, in places like, you know, Sweden, for example, you know, like the police are not tasked with responding to people who are in the middle of mental health crises, right? I mean, like, you know, you have we see so many stories in the United States of, you know, police responding to people who are in the midst of mental health crises, and the police end up shooting them dead, right? I mean, this happens over and over again. And, you know, in a place like Sweden, the government just hires mental health professionals to deal with those episodes, right? Because those are the people that are actually tasked with and trained in doing those types of things. You know, we can look at other places, you know, where you know, other nations where they invest in, you know, in helping people who are homeless secure the things that they need to get on their feet, securing housing, securing job access and training, and so on and so forth. And then you know, that fundamentally then removes the regulation of homeless populations, the constant arresting and surveillance of homeless populations. That removes that from what police are tasked with doing. And so I think any sort of reform that we are going to be thinking about is not really going to be within the police department itself. I mean, the city of Chicago, the Chicago Police Department just responded last week to like earlier this summer, the mayor had implemented a task force to recommend, you know, whatever reforms they thought should happen with the Chicago Police Department. And this task force, you know, labored all summer and submitted a list of recommended reforms that was over 150 long. Chicago Police Department looked at it and last week announced that they were accepting 5 of them, and they were the 5 that were the most vague and the most toothless and most ineffective, are bound to be most ineffective. And the reason that I say that is because I think that when we're thinking about reform, we don't need to think about it, and I think we're foolish to think about things that we can do to reform police departments internally. That I think when we're thinking about reform, really what we should be thinking about is stripping away the things that we allow and task police with doing, because what we should be aiming for is the most radical and complete reduction of officer interactions with people that don't need to happen. And so, you know, thinking about broader ways that we can, you know, remove the police power from these various social interactions, these various, you know, these various things that police have been asked and allowed to do. I think that's the sort of reform that we should be pursuing.
Okay, so we're looking forward to your book that you're working on about Fred Hampton.
Thank
So
you.
this next question kind of takes us there in advance. Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Panther's idea of community control of police and contemporary police abolitionism, and whether you think the idea of community control is a meaningful alternative to liberal police reform that you just talked about, and the complete abolition of police as we know it now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that the effort for community control of the police was, it was not really an abolitionist argument. It was also not it was certainly not a reform, like a liberal reformist argument. I mean, I should be very clear about that. The reason that I say it was not an abolitionist argument was because there was no articulation of a future world without police and without prisons. At least not within the context of the Chicago movement for community control. But it was, you know, if we think about the future of policing and how people are talking about it and envisioning it kind of on a spectrum of, you know, on the one hand of, you know, no changes are necessary to policing at all, over here to like, liberal reforms on policing here to abolition here. Like, if we think about all of these, visions and ideas on a spectrum, I think that the effort for community control lies much closer to here than it does somewhere else over here. And the reason that I say that is because, and to kind of come back to the point, the defunding of police is not the same thing as abolishing the police. But I think that the defunding of police, through things like removing them from as many facets of social and community life as we possibly can, and reinvesting that money into social goods, into things that will better people's lives, into things that will make the supposed need for police obsolete. Community control was much more about that, right? It was much more about defunding, and we can think about defunding as being sort of on the road to abolition. So community control was really a vision for looking at the Chicago Police Department and saying, look, we shouldn't have a centralized police bureaucracy that is housed basically in downtown Chicago, and that we have very little political control and say over. That centralized police bureaucracy should not be able to enact policy across the entire city for what policing is going to look like in various neighborhoods. And so what the community control movement said was, look, maybe the west side of Chicago should have its own kind of it should be its own kind of policing system. And people that live in that community should be able to set police policies, should be able to hire and fire people as they wanted, and should also be able to envision alternative forms of public safety if they wanted. And that was part of what was being called for with the call to basically say, why are we spending so much money on the police when we're reaping none of the supposed benefits of it? Mm-hmm. And so, the effort for community control, which was calling for, not the abolition of police generally, but the abolition of police as it was currently constituted at the citywide level, and was also calling for, they didn't have the language of defunding. I mean, if you go look through these documents, nobody's saying defund the police. That's a language that's new. But they were saying defund the police in so many words, right? I mean, they were saying, let's take a huge chunk of the police budget and reinvest it in things that will nurture people, that will give people health and life and support, that will allow people the opportunities that they need, that will allow people the lives that they need, that will allow people the lives that they deserve. Mm-hmm. And there was an intuitive assumption in that argument that if you do those things, if people have the things that they need to live sustainable and meaningful and healthy lives, if people have the opportunities to pursue their dreams and do the things that they would like to do, that maybe the supposed need for police just goes away. And that was really central, I think, to the vision of community control. And so I see a lot of harmony between that vision and a lot of calls to defund the police now. As I said, it's not like the effort for community control, I would not say it was an abolitionist argument. I would certainly say that it was an argument in support of defunding the police, and that I can see when I look closely kind of visions of pursuing an abolitionist future, even if people were not necessarily articulating a full abolitionist future within those particular moments in time.